You look resplendent in your red dress, and
Thank you.
it's a rainy morning here in Lakeside, so you're bringing some color and some excitement to the place.
Trying to do so. I'm going to kind of probably give them a little something today. So hopefully it'll be well received. I'm looking
That sounds wonderful. So we're just about ready to go live. Good morning from Lakeside, Chautauqua, where we are here with Dr. Shively T.J. Smith, Assistant Professor of New Testament at Boston University School of Theology. Good morning, Dr. Smith, and welcome back to Lakeside. It's kind of a rainy morning in Lakeside, so we're looking forward to a spiritual uplift, and I know that Dr. Smith has that for us today. I would remind you that this evening we have Vespers at the Steele Memorial Bandstand at 7:30, and that will be with Reverend Dr. Greg Linville preaching, and the music by Kay McIntosh. And then tomorrow evening is our picnic in Perry Park, and we need to go on the website and sign up for that. It's $6 per person, and it's a great time of fellowship with other Lakesiders. This week's religious seminar is presented by Nancy Flinchbaugh, a Christian contemplative and author who is leading us in Lectio Divina. She did a great job yesterday of introducing it, and we looked at two of the Psalms, and we reflected on that together. And she has more for us planned on Wednesday afternoon from 3 until 4:30 p.m. at the train station patio. And then I remind you that Faith Walk devotional booklets are available for your use, and also that we have spiritual directors available this summer, Jenny Pippin, the Reverend Sharon Seafarth Garner, and the Reverend Tom Frost, who will help us in our spiritual journey one-on-one. You can make an appointment by calling the Lakeside number and extension 214, which is Religious Life, and you will have a one-on-one appointment with them. And this is live and direct. This is not virtual, but this is live. Well, this morning, through the miracle of technology, even though it is raining in Lakeside, and we would not be able to be at the Steele Memorial Bandstand, and due to COVID, so we would have to cancel. But due to technology, we're able to have Dr. Smith here live and direct with us from Boston University. And yesterday, her image of the spring was really refreshing and helpful to us all. And this morning, I can hardly wait to see what the image is for today. And I don't want to take any more of your time. So Dr. Smith, welcome. Welcome back to Lakeside. You were very well received yesterday. And I realize you have to take my word for it because there aren't other people here, but I assure you that from the feedback we've been receiving, you've been receiving, folks do appreciate your presentation. And we're so happy to have you with us and taking this time this summer for us. And it is our fond hope that we will have you here in person with your family, your husband, your two daughters. And we look forward to that in the future. God bless you as you bring us God's word for this morning.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It is indeed a delight and a joy to be with you again on this Tuesday morning. We just appreciated the time of Faith for Living Hour yesterday morning, and the feedback and the engagement, and hope that word traveled with you throughout the day. So let us turn today to our Faith for Living moment. I'm going to share my screen. Give me a second. For this Faith for Living Hour this week, just as a refresher for some of our return, for those who are returning from yesterday, and for those who may be joining us for the first time this morning, I'm using this Faith for Living Hour as a centering moment in which we leverage the words of Howard Thurman by paying attention to the images he uses. The images that he uses to invite us into the contemplative space, to invite us into the spiritual space of our inner work, to invite us in the space of seeking to expand and extend our relationality to God, to our neighbors, and to ourselves. And then we're using those images that Thurman gives us to help us do some of our spiritual and faithful work, to also look at how they are used in the biblical text as well. Again, I am thankful indeed to to the Lakeside Chautauqua organizers for the invitation, for the opportunity to be among my peers and colleagues who are presenting all summer. It is indeed a joy and a blessing to be with you. So I want to invite you, as I did yesterday morning, to get comfortable wherever you are, to find yourself in a centering space. Grab a journal or a piece of paper to reflect on for a few minutes. If you're a person who thinks and meditates through writing, I am one of those people. Or find yourself in a comfortable space looking out on the rain or the pretty scenery, or just in a quiet space. Thurman would say it this way: center down. To center down is to sit quietly and to see oneself pass by. Let us enter into the moment of sitting down, sitting quietly, and watching ourselves pass by. I'm starting each meditation with a reading from Howard Thurman's meditations book called Meditations of the Heart. Again, Howard Thurman is known as a spiritual mystic, theologian. He was dean of chapel at Boston University. Marsh Chapel actually was the first African American to hold a deanship at a predominantly historically white institution at the time. And he was actually a teacher and advisor to Martin Luther King Jr. Thurman was known as the spiritual sage and even pastor of the civil rights movement in many ways. And in fact, he ended up being named by magazines such as Time magazine as one of the most powerful and influential preachers of his day in the 1940s and 50s. Thurman was a co-founder of one of the, if not the first multicultural interfaith congregation in the US in the 1940s. So Thurman really was a trailblazer in thinking about how our spirituality makes a demand on us in our inner being, but also in our relationality and proximity and responsibility to God, to our neighbors, to the earth. That was very powerful and led very radical forms of living in relationality, spiritual and social relationality with others. The meditation that I'm reading today is called I Will Lift Up Mine Eyes. Again, this is from the book Meditations of the Heart. Enter into this centering space with me, my sisters and brothers and siblings. I will lift up mine eyes. I will lift up mine eyes. Scarcely knowing it, I have become increasingly self-centered. My mind focused upon all the details of my little life and the endless trivialities of a daily routine. I hover over all my little aches and pains, my petty annoyances, and my little frustrations, while the band around my head tightens and tightens until at last I would despair completely. Then out of no place comes sometimes a gentle, sometimes startling reminder, and I lift up mine eyes. The reminder may be a tale of heroism and courage brought to me over the sound waves of the air. It may be the snatches of a melody long ago forgotten, but with it come flooding in vast recollections of other days freighted with beauty and tenderness. It may be a chance telephone call that nets a reassurance that what I can do for someone beyond the borders of my place relates me to them so urgently that my self-indulgence shames my spirit and chastises my mind. I will lift up mine eyes. I will lift up mine eyes to life, that I may read the guidepost along my way and not miss the important turning in the road. I will lift up my eyes to love. that I may not close the door of my heart to the knocking hand, the tender cry, the anxious reach. I will lift up my eyes to God, that I may meet God's spirit, not only in the high place, the great moment, the penetrating call, but also in the byways, the little duties, the stinging irritations, and the sad and bottomless renunciations. And for me, this is enough. For I will, I shall, I must, I will lift up mine eyes. For a few moments, I want us to pay attention to and ponder the imagery that Thurman gives us of mine eyes. Eyes. Mine eyes. What do you visualize when you ponder the image of mine eyes? This is a moment of centering, to sit quietly and to see oneself pass by. Thurman says that one of the ways in which we can understand how we relate to God, to neighbor, to ourselves, to our inner life, is through understanding what it means to lift up mine eyes. What does it look like to lift up mine eyes? Whose eyes do you see? Where are those eyes from? What do those eyes see? What do those eyes miss? What are they blind to? What do they overlook? What do they ignore? What do mine eyes divert my eyes from? Mine eyes. What do you visualize when you ponder the image, the work of mine eyes? As I did yesterday, I want to help this along a little bit by producing some images, but I want to give you a second. Think about it. Whose eyes do I see when I think of mine eyes? Whose eyes do I miss? Whose eyes do I ignore? Whose eyes do I erase? Whose eyes do I overlook? Whose eyes do I never consider? Perhaps you envision your own eyes, or the eyes of someone else. They have a different face than you. They come from a different place. Their eyes have seen different things, have different histories hidden behind them in their head and their heart that they're carrying in their hands. Mine eyes. Whose eyes do you see? Where are those eyes from? What do those eyes do? What do they see? What do they consider? Perhaps you envision the eyes of all those first responders, lifting up their eyes to engage in the work of care, healing, and sustaining and extending life. You envision the eyes of those involved in the sacred practice of life care. Mine eyes are their eyes. Perhaps the eyes that you envision are the eyes of our canine companions or our friends that see for us when we need help with vision. Those that journey with us along the way to make sure that we are safe, that we are moving in the ways that allow us to interact with the world and the world to interact with us, and we are able to flourish and live in safety and protection and provision. Perhaps the eyes that you envision are the eyes of those who journey with you through good and bad, when it's easy and when it's difficult, when you want them there and when you don't want them there. Perhaps the eyes you envision are our partners. Perhaps the eyes that you envision are related to the objects we use to see clearly, to see more in focus, that which is around us. You are envisioning the hardware, the tools, the props that help our eyes to do more work. They extend our vision long and wide. They make that which we see that is colorful even more colorful and vivid. Perhaps you are envisioning the lenses we use to not only see what is in front of us in the moment, but to capture it so that we can hold on to it. Perhaps when you envision mine eyes, you envision the spaces that we go to and the people we consult to check our eyes. So you envision the care that we need to give to our eyes. You envision the places that we go and the items that we use to check to see what is the state of our vision? What is the condition of our seeing? Perhaps you envision the checkup process of sight. Or perhaps you envision something that just fills your soul with joy. When you think of mine eyes, you think of the puppy dog eyes. You think about those eyes that look at you with innocence, with love, with joy, with hope. You think of those eyes that look up at you without judgment, without holding things against you. You think of those eyes that look at you and let you know that there is yet living and life for you to do. Perhaps you envision the puppy dog eyes. Or perhaps you envision something a little bit fiercer, a little bit more fierce, a little bit fiercer. You envision the eyes of the tiger. You envision the eyes of those go-getters. You envision the eyes of those who seem to have no fear. They are courageous when everyone else is running away. They stand strong when those are falling to the side. They speak truth, faith, love, hope, community, when that is unpopular. Maybe you envision the eyes of the tiger, that determination, the eyes of those who are persistent, the eyes of those who are resilient, the eyes of those who persevere, the eyes of those who continue to fight for what is right and what is truthful, even when they are embattled. You envision the tiger eyes. Perhaps when you think of mine eyes, you don't think so much about eyes as much as you think about what we take in through them. You envision the surprises of life that we see and that we encounter. What it feels like, what it looks like to see something that was unexpected, to be surprised by other human beings, to be surprised by the mysteries of God, to be surprised that the Spirit of God is still yet moving in this world. You envision what it means to encounter God and others in new and fresh ways, and for that surprise to do work on you. Thurman calls it in another meditation, the glad surprise. Perhaps when you think about eyes, you imagine the things we collectively open our eyes to as communities. It's not just one pair of eyes, one set of eyes. You envision the eyes of many people looking on at the events of the world together, reasoning together, surprised together, standing together, seeing, or in the language of our faith, bearing witness. You envision the eyes of our collective witness in the world. It transgresses ethnicity and race. It transgresses age. It transgresses gender and sexuality. It transgresses our histories and economics. It transgresses our locations and geographies. You envision what it means to be a faithful community bearing witness together with our eyes, our collective seeing. Or perhaps when we talk about eyes, we need to pay attention to those things that we as a community, that we as faith communities shut our eyes to. What is it that we hide from our sight, that we don't want to acknowledge, that we don't want to see, that we don't want to get involved in, that we as faithful communities choose together not to acknowledge, not to talk about, not to struggle and wrestle and reckon with? Perhaps when we talk about eyes, we need to talk about the ways in which we collectively choose not to see that which challenges us, which disrupts our day-to-day lives, which calls us to new forms of accountability and presence with our God, with our neighbor, and with ourselves. And we are not just shutting our eyes individually, but we are shutting our eyes as communities. Perhaps we should talk about that which we choose to turn a blind eye to as communities of faith. Or perhaps when we think about eyes, there is something life-giving to think about what it means to behold the beautiful sights, possibilities, opportunities, potential that God, that the living God and God's Spirit has before us. It is like looking on across the water with the sun rising and setting, recognizing that God's mercies are new every morning, recognizing that we can never, ever outdo God. It is to take in what is possible. It is invisible and unseen, and yet we know that out there in the horizon, there is something there. God is calling us to look out across the horizon and see her presence in the world. Perhaps when we think about eyes, we should think about that which God is calling us to behold in awe, in admiration, in reverence, in humility, in beauty. So I ask you again, what do you visualize when you ponder Thurman's image of mine eyes? Who do you see? What do you see? Where are those eyes from? Where do they go? What do those eyes seek to do? What do those eyes ignore? What communities are those eyes a part of? What do you visualize when you ponder Thurman's image of eyes? As I said yesterday, I'm a biblical scholar, so I have to go to the Bible. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing my job. So I want to talk a little bit about eyes in the Bible, just to kind of give you a sense. Now, here we have Thurman using eyes as imagery for us to think about our spiritual inner work, but our relational work to God, neighbor, and ourselves. And the language and imagery of eyes are also a part of the biblical text. References to eyes show up across the Bible in different forms. On one hand, the Bible makes multiple references to the actual bodily organ of eyes and the function of seeing. For example, when we are in the garden with Eve and she is in the exchange with the snake, the text references Eve's eyes and the function of sight in Genesis 3:6. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. Eyes are actually something in the Bible that actually we use to see and make decisions with. Another way in which eyes are referenced in the Bible as sources of physical beauty. We sometimes miss this. So eyes are referenced as sources of physical beauty and amour and love. A great place to see this is in the Song of Songs. So when you go to the Song of Songs, there are references such as Song of Songs 1, verse 15, where it says, "Ah, you are beautiful, my love. Ah, you are beautiful, and your eyes are doves." Song of Song, chapter 4, verse 9. Remember, eyes become a source of beauty, of amour. Here in chapter 4, verse 9 in Song of Songs, we hear this: "You have ravaged my heart, my sister, my bride. You have ravaged my heart with the glance of your eyes, with one jewel of your necklace. You have ravaged my heart." Eyes in the biblical text are also common metaphors and imagery stock for spiritual consciousness or awareness, spiritual knowledge or discernment, or what some of us may even want to talk about as spiritual wisdom. Frequently, with this connotation, the eyes are referenced with the ears. Sight and hearing go together as mechanisms, as images, as metaphors, again, for providing spiritual knowledge or consciousness, or the way in which the biblical text talks about the spiritual consciousness, the spiritual awareness, the spiritual knowledge. See, for example, in Proverbs chapter 20, verse 12 says, "The hearing ear and the seeing eye, the Lord has made them both." Another place is in Isaiah 6:10. "Make the mind of this people dull, and stop their ears and shut their eyes, so that they may not look with their eyes and listen with their ears and comprehend with their minds and turn and be healed." So here we have three different ways in which eyes are showing up across the biblical text. One is as an actual physical part of our body, as the organ that we use to see. Second is that eyes are referenced as sources of beauty, sources of amour. The other is that eyes are referenced and sight are referenced in relationship to spiritual knowledge, spiritual wisdom, spiritual perception. But I don't want to stop to just talk about eyes as physical organs. I really want to spend some time pressing in on the language of eyes as spiritual and religious sight in the Bible in a couple of forms. And sight in the Bible appears in many different ways in terms of sight as spiritual sight in many different forms. And I do not have enough time here to go through all of them. So I kind of get to pick some of my favorites. So I'm going to pick some of my favorites, recognizing that there's a whole range of imagery and ways in which sight is being used and referenced to talk about this sort of spiritual awareness, this spiritual knowledge, or even this sort of spiritual inner self that we see Thurman talking about in his writing. So the first way I want to talk about it is sight as referenced in regards to God talk. And the next way that I want to talk about it is sight as reference to this sort of human knowledge, this human spiritual consciousness, particularly human spiritual consciousness about God and God's presence in the world. So indulge me for a second as we do this. The first way in which we see sight in the biblical text being talked about, particularly in relationship to God talk, is to characterize God as a seeing God. God is a seeing God. This represents how human sight becomes an image or a characterization for God. So it's the anthropomorphic description of God. It's making God more relatable to us because God has some of the same features that we have, and or vice versa. That God talk, right? What is the relationship to God? God is both a mystery and yet there's something familiar about God. And one of those familiar characteristics is this seeing God. Here I have some different verses that give you some options for this. I think that the Psalms are one of the greatest resources for looking at how God, the anthropomorphic portrayals of God that are showing up in sort of praise and in lament, in prayers and in worship. Which is a rich resource for looking at all the many different ways in which God is assigned human features and characteristics in order to understand how God works in the world and who we are in the world. So here are some of my favorite. Psalms 33:18 says, "Truly the eye of the Lord is on those who fear God, on those who hope in God's steadfast love." Here we get a God who is one who sees like humans with physical eyes being configured in Psalms 33:18. When we look at Psalm 34:15, it says, "The eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and God's ears are open to their cry." Here, God has vision and hearing, eyes and ears, which, as I shared, may also signify some form of spiritual perception. There are things God is aware of that only God can know, that only God can see with God's own eyes and God's own hearing. Another reference is Psalm 17:2. "From you, let my vindication come. Let your eyes see the right." Here we get to see a God, we get a God that is represented and portrayed as a God who has the ability and capacity to see, but may not choose to see. So here in Psalm 17:2, we get a petition being made to God for God to see, for God to look onto the situation. This is in line with what we see in Isaiah chapter 1, verse 15 through 16 in a very similar way. Look at this. "When you stretch out your hands, I will hide my eyes." So this is God talking through the prophet. "When you stretch out your hands, I will hide my eyes from you. Even though you make many prayers, I will not listen to your hands. I will not listen. Your hands are full of blood. Wash yourselves, make yourselves clean. Remove the evil of your doings from before my eyes. Cease to do evil." So here in Isaiah, through the prophet's voice, we're hearing God who has the option, the capacity, the ability, the history of seeing, who is opting out of seeing. God can refuse to see. God can refuse to look at what is happening. That's what you hear the prophet saying in this way. This is important when you think about the God talk that's occurring in the biblical text. When you go to some place like Psalm 115, verse 5, in which we start talking about the abilities and capacities of idols. Here, Psalms 115:5 says, "They have mouths, but they do not speak, eyes, but do not see." One of the big differences between this one God, this sovereign God, is that God not only has, I would say, the hardware to do the hearing and to do the seeing, but God can actually choose to see or not see, hear or not hear. Whereas juxtaposed to the idols around this language of eyes in the biblical text, they cannot see. They are blind, is what they're saying. So they don't have the option to choose to see or not see. So one of the ways in which the biblical text, particularly in this part of the text, is sort of configuring and amplifying the sovereignty of God with the language of eyes, is to juxtapose the sovereign God who can choose to see or not see to idols who can never see. All right. Another way in which the biblical text talks about eyes and uses eyes to engage in a particular kind of conversation is to talk about eyes in relationship to human and spiritual knowledge. Here, human and spiritual knowledge has to do with wisdom or folly, light or darkness, wisdom or foolishness, right? What it means to be wise. So here in Psalm 119, 18, we hear, open my eyes so that I may behold wondrous things out of your law. Similar manner, Psalm 119, 37, turn my eyes from looking at vanities. Give me life in your ways. And then Psalm 19, 8, the precepts of the Lord are rejoicing the heart, are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is clear, enlightening the eyes. So here, what we see is that sight is frequently being used as sort of a symbol of human knowledge, perception, or I would actually talk about it in terms of human understanding and comprehension. And this is usually accompanied by an awareness, a knowledge of, a taking in of the law, right? Of the word of God, taking in what it means to be a people with a holy word, with traditions, with history, with interpretive practices, with story, with connection, a faith people with the lineage, with this long historic lineage. One of the things we often miss when we see this language of law that's showing up in the biblical text in relationship to sight is just how multifaceted this language is. We're not just talking about laws and commandments. We're talking about a history of a people who has a history of journeying with God. It's a narrative of a people. It's their story. It's their collective wisdom. It's their collective it's their collective movements together and with the earth and with God. I mean, there's just something very rich that's being configured and named here in terms of what you see. That the text is using. So I love this. I love this imagery and the richness of it. Ecclesiastes 2, 1 through 2, chapter 2, verses 12 through 14, is very interesting when you think about eyes and what eyes, how using our eyes provides a certain kind of spiritual knowledge and wisdom or foolishness. Look at this. Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 12 through 14 says, so I turn to consider wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the one do who comes after the king? Only what has already been done. Then I saw that wisdom excels folly, as light excels darkness. The wise have eyes in their head, but fools walk in darkness. Yet I perceived that the same fate befalls all of them. Here we get the contrast. The wise person who is seeing is contrasted to the foolish person using the image of sight, using the image of eyes. Also notice one of the things that's really important in Ecclesiastes here is the way in which imagery of light and darkness are also closely related. So in the biblical text, when we have eyes and sight being configured, it's quite normal, it's quite frequent that in fact this dual dualism of light and darkness is showing up in the text in a real way, which is one of the reasons why when you deal with eyes and when you deal with sight, you see it in the Psalms, you see it in places such as the prophets like Isaiah, and you see it quite a lot in the apocalyptic literature of our text, from Revelation to Ezekiel. Sight and blindness, light and darkness. These are dualisms that these types of writings are using to help us understand what it means to have this sort of spiritual wisdom that is, I would like to say, permeating and infecting our ways of being in the world. As the New Testament scholar, I must move to the New Testament at least briefly for a moment. One of the prominent, there's a lot of language of sight and eyes in the New Testament. I absolutely cannot go through that all here. So I picked up a few places that are interesting, that sometimes might get missed as imagery of sight that's there, because you get some of the other ones that are a little bit more popular. So I wanted to pick up a couple of these. So one of the most prominent expectations about the Christ figure in the Gospels is this sort of recovery of sight to the blind. So here we have Luke 4:18, where Jesus is standing up with his inaugural sort of message, pronouncing his mission, right, and his work in the world. And he takes the Isaiah scroll and he says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free." So a function of Jesus' ministry is, on one level, yes, physical sight. So we get all these miracles of Jesus providing sight to the blind. One of my favorite that I've written on before, it was Jesus providing sight, the healing of blind Bartimaeus in Mark chapter 10:46. So this language so on one level we see sight, the recovery of the sight is actually a physical recovery that Jesus is talking about, but it also is very much a spiritual one, right? That something about this sight is also related to its place, especially in places such as the Gospel of Mark. It's also related to understanding specifically what the work of the Messiah and the Christ figure is, and what the work of the followers of Christ should be. Like, can you see the mission? Can you see the good news? Do you understand that comprehension and understanding? Do you understand what it really means to love God and love neighbor and love self? What does it mean to care for the outcast? What does it mean to proclaim release to the captives? What does it mean? Who are they? Where are they? Right? So part of this sight in the New Testament text has everything to do with understanding the task and the activities of what it means to be, in this case, I would say, way believers of the way, right? The followers of Jesus, disciples of Jesus that are seeking to build new communities, right? New ways of being in relationship to God, neighbor, and self. The last thing I want to point out here on this is, in the New Testament in particular, is to recognize that one of the places where this relationship of faith and sight is most explicitly named is in the Gospel of John. So I keep going back to the Gospel of John. I recognize with some of these images, and part of it is because I find that the Johannine literature has such potent imagery that works really well in sort of thinking about Howard Thurman. But right there in the Gospel of John, we end up getting this the centerpiece theme in John 9 of the healing of the man born blind, where physical sight and this sort of spiritual understanding, as one scholarly source talks about it, are both at the center of the concern. So it's both physical sight, but it also spiritual understanding, spiritual discernment that's going hand in hand in this story, John chapter 9. So the Gospel of John sums up the results of Jesus' public ministry by once again quoting what? Isaiah 6:10. So you see that Isaiah 6:10 text is actually one that keeps showing up across the biblical text from the Old Testament to the New Testament when we start talking about these different dimensions of eyes, of sight in the biblical text. So Isaiah 6:10, make the mind of this people dull and stop their ears and shut their eyes, so that they may not look with their eyes and listen with their ears and comprehend with their minds and turn and be healed. The language of eyes and the language of sight are rich, rich imagery in the biblical text from the Old Testament to the New Testament, and it is rich, rich imagery for Howard Thurman. So I want to invite you once again to take a posture of centering, to sit quietly and let yourself pass by, and take in these words from Howard Thurman's meditation. I will lift up mine eyes. Once I finish reading it, I'm going to offer just a brief couple of minutes of additional reflection to extend the imagery of mine eyes. But take a moment of pause and hear these words from Thurman once again. I will lift up mine eyes. Scarcely knowing it, I have become increasingly self-centered. My mind focused upon all the details of my little life, in the endless trivialities of a daily routine. I hover over all my little aches and pains, my petty annoyances, my little frustrations, while the band around my head tightens and tightens until at last I would despair completely. Then out of no place comes sometimes a gentle, sometimes startling reminder, and I lift up mine eyes. The reminder may be a tale of heroism and courage brought to me over the sound waves of the air. It may be the snatches of a melody long ago forgotten, but with it come flooding in vast recollections of other days freighted with beauty and tenderness. It may be a chance telephone call that nets a reassurance that what I can do for someone beyond the borders of my place relate me to them so urgently that my self-indulgence shames my spirit and chastises my mind. I will lift up mine eyes. I will lift up mine eyes to life, that I may read the guidepost along my way and not miss the important turning in the road. I will lift up mine eyes to love, that I may not close the door of my heart to the knocking hand, the tender cry, the anxious reach. I will lift up mine eyes to God, that I may meet God's Spirit, not only in the high place, the great moment, the penetrating call, but also in the byways, in the little duties, the stinging irritations and the sad and bottomless renunciations. And for me, this is enough. I will lift up mine eyes. Take in this last word of meditation. This is what I hear, what I imagine when I lift up mine eyes.
We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
I hope this meditation has encouraged you as it has encouraged me. I hope you will join me this day and us collectively, wherever we are and whatever we may be doing, that we may together lift up our eyes to see God, to see neighbor, and to see ourselves. God bless you this day.
Amen. Thank you so much, Dr. Smith. I want to remind those that are with us that you can respond with questions and comments via the media that you're using. Please use those devices and respond. We would love to hear from you. And as we do that, there are a few comments that have come in that I want to share, but I wanted to start with a couple of my own. I appreciate so much this image, Dr. Smith. I'm a person that's worn glasses since I was in the 4th grade. And so the idea of mine eyes is quite relevant to me. I also think about a good and close friend of mine who is blind and has gone blind in adulthood. And always these images in the Bible are both physical and symbolic. And for him, especially symbolic, because the idea of he not seeing as ignorance or sin is not relevant, yes. but in the spiritual sense, it is, of course, for all of us. So I would just put that caveat out there, and maybe you want to make a comment.
I think that absolutely that there. So on one level, when we talk about all of these metaphors and images that Thurman is using and that we're seeing in the biblical text, on one level, it's what metaphors do, right? So on one level, metaphors provide us access to and talking about that which is difficult for us to articulate and talk about in and of itself. So we talk about it relative to something else. But on another level, these metaphors and images break down and can actually be quite dangerous in real ways. And one of these places where you see, I think, that breakdown and that danger is around this language of sight. That's part of the reason why I intentionally put in this sort of talking about how we seeing different ways and what that means. So I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, actually around the School of the Blind, was like literally right around the corner. So it was very common. It was a part of my day to be in community with people who had different forms of seeing than I did. So there's a way in which this biblical text for me is always, this image is always dangerous. A couple of things I would say about that in terms of how do we process that. On one level, I think we process that by recognizing that the social norms and value codes of the ancient world is different from our modern day ethics. I mean, so on one level, our ethics and our understanding of what is normal, what is God, what is a part of God's creative presence in the world. I think that that's part of the beauty of God, this God talk that is not static, but ongoing, that there's a different way of recognizing and affirming bodies that we now can press against the biblical text on and look at it in a real way and challenge in a real way. The other thing is the ways in which sometimes what we miss is the social movement that's happening when Jesus is engaging with issues of different bodies with different abilities in different places. Jesus moves towards this radical inclusion of bodies that those communities are used to excluding. So when you see something like blind Bartimaeus or even the John 9 text, it's not just the healing that's really most profound. It's the ways in which these are bodies that communities have excluded, that put these bodies in danger, that put them outside of community, that Jesus creates the space to bring into community, to not only bring into community, but to sit alongside and be with, to invite to journey with him on the way. First and foremost, to me, that's the great challenge for us, that this imagery of sight invites, is to invite us to think about how do we create communities in new communities in our society with the bodies and the locations and the experiences that our society normally ignores, pushes to the side, pushes to the margins. Silence. Blind Bartimaeus in John 10, they told him to be quiet, right? Stop talking, you're screaming too much. And you see Jesus leaning into that noise. So that's one of the reasons why I love this. I love the image of sight, the way in which it both affirms and challenges.
Definitely. And it means more than just building handicap ramps and stuff like that, but it's the full inclusion of people that are marginalized.
Inclusion means relationality. Inclusion means that we journey together, that we don't just reference each other, but we know each other. We are involved in each other's living and each other's life in real concrete ways. When we're dealing with issues of sight with Jesus in the Gospels, oftentimes that leads to table fellowship. You can't get any more intimate than that in the ancient world. So, I mean, I really think there's a prime opportunity for us to think about our faith as calls for new forms of relationality and proximity to each other.
Thank you. I have a couple of comments here from John William Smith, which are very helpful. He said, I am amazed at how folks are able to close their eyes to scientific facts in the time of pandemic and instead focus on false stories. Our ability to see clearly is very conditioned by our preconceived notions of what we want the truth to be. Yeah. Holy Scripture seems to assume the ability to see clearly, but today we have many false images competing for clarity. And then he goes on, our ability to see what we want to see also impacts our attitudes on racism. Do we see all people as children of God? And this relates to what you were just saying, all people as children of God, or do we see a racial order to the world, a caste system based on skin color? It is amazing that now in 2020, this vision is still so strong in this country.
Yeah.
Very, very insightful reflections, I think. And
thank
you may want to comment on that.
I just say absolutely. I'm in total agreement. I mean, I think the other piece of the sight piece that's important now that we see, which is in line with what both of us are saying, I think, is that part of sight, again, I ended with saying proximity. It's about, it's also about figuring out how to see through the eyes of others. That even when you get into the wisdom literature and the Psalms, and you get these sort of the anthropomorphic characteristics being placed on God, it's not just placing on God what we see. It actually is trying to play with the faithful imagination to get us to begin to see God, to see the world as God sees the world, to see ourselves as God's created creation, as God sees us, which then makes a demand on us to, I always talk about it, is to come a little bit higher in our moral compass, and in our ability to see God and see neighbor and see ourselves in new and fresh ways. So I think part of the challenge, even with the sight and the sight with science, is the fact that we're not, because we don't see it immediately in our households, maybe, it's hard for us to recognize that part of what we should be doing is also paying attention to, well, what's happening with my neighbors, right? And that there's something happening, right? And there's some way in which I need to see that, right? And by seeing that and being attentive to that, then things can happen in me. At least that's for Thurman, that's an essential piece. That if I can't make the change in and of myself, if I pay more attention to my neighbor and see them and see the world through their eyes, that change starts working on me.
Yes, Beautiful image. I want to thank you and thank Howard Thurman and thank God for this beautiful image of the eyes that will lift up mine eyes. And it's a great way for us to start another day at Lakeside. And I want to give a big shout out to Sue Cox and to her family and for their generosity in creating the Bud Cox Endowment. Shively Bud Cox was our executive director here at Lakeside for several years and is much beloved by this community. And his wife has created this endowment in his memory, which continues his legacy. And we thank those folks for that. I also want to mention to you that Dr. Shively Smith's book, Strangers to Family, is available at our fine print bookstore and also online. And if you wish to order that, they will help you do that here at Lakeside. And we'll be back tomorrow with another image from Howard Thurman and some more insights from Dr. Shively Smith, Assistant Professor of New Testament at Boston University, and we received your PhD at Emory University, and who comes to us through the miracle of technology each morning this week. Dr. Smith, God bless you in your ministry, and we'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
God bless everyone this day.
Thank you.